Good evening, everyone. Unexpectedly, it falls to me to introduce our speaker this evening, and such a pleasure it is. Oh, apparently I'm not correct. There we go. Okay. Forgive me if what I say is less than extensive, but about 45 seconds ago, I didn't know I was to be standing here in front of you. But having said that, I couldn't imagine a nicer person and a dearer colleague for whom I now have to introduce you to. We're here this evening to hear Jennifer Howes speak about her wonderful new book, which is here and which I believe is for sale later.
I have a few copies.
There are a few copies, yes. Jennifer, as many of you will know, has worked in this area for a long time. She studied, first of all, at SOAS. Her doctorate there has a South Indian subject. She later worked at the British Library for many years and now works as an independent scholar. A situation that many of us could aspire to, I think. Anyway, leaving that behind, she's going to speak to us this evening about her new book, which is the result of many years of study and of work, drawing no doubt on her long period of work at the British Library and much work since then. And it's going to be entitled, as you can see here on the screen, The Art of a Corporation, the East India Company as Patron and Collector. And I ask you to receive her now in the usual way, and we look forward very much to hearing what you have to say, Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you for coming today. And thank you, Richard. In recent years, there's been a surge of interest in Britain's imperial history, and more specifically in the East India Company. Some of this work investigates the East India Company's relationship with art, and that's what my book does. But I've done something that hasn't been attempted before. The focus of my book is provenance. In The Art of a Corporation, I've specifically written about the East India Company as a corporate patron of the arts. The East India Company was one of the longest surviving multinational corporations in the world. It was founded in 1600, and it was dissolved in the late 19th century. Its art collections, which you can still find in London today, are undisputedly the most interesting corporately gathered art collection in Britain, and perhaps in the world. Here's a picture of East India House, the headquarters of the East India Company in the City of London. Don't try and look for it today. The building was torn down in 1862. The artworks I'll be talking by the East India Company, the corporate entity that was headquartered here. The East India Company was established by royal charter in 1600, and its purpose was originally to import goods from the East to London. But by the 18th century, when this building was constructed, it had transformed into an imperial power. Now, I just want to show you a little map. So here's the square mile, the City of London. And you can see on the map, there are some of the landmarks that everyone knows about today. You have St. Paul's Cathedral in the top left corner and Tower Bridge in the lower right corner. This red cross is where East India House was located. But the company had previously been located in, been headquartered in other locations in the City of London, which were roughly here, 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 and here. So the East India Company moved around. It had several different headquarters before this building was constructed. This picture is of the Court of Proprietors room inside of East India House. It was in this room that the East India Company's shareholders attended quarterly meetings. Anyone who held East India Company stock could attend these meetings. But to vote at the meetings, you had to hold a particular quantity of stock. And all manner of business was voted upon inside of this room. One of the things that they would occasionally vote on was whether the East India Company should commission a new artwork. And such commissions were usually made to commemorate an important event. So, for example, after the East India Company established its pension fund, the Court of Proprietors voted unanimously to commission a painting that commemorated the foundation of the pension scheme. And that's this painting here, which I'll tell you a little bit more about shortly. So I'm going to focus on 3 artworks. They're all portraits, beginning with the one on the left, which shows John Dean, the survivor of a shipwreck that occurred in 1738. Then after looking at John Dean, I'm going to look at the painting in the center. It's the one that I just showed you, of Robert Clive and the Nawab of Bengal. It dramatizes the moment when the East India Company's pension scheme was founded. And then finally, I'll look at the marble memorial pictured on the right that was dedicated to Edward Cook and placed in Westminster Abbey. I want to give you an idea of why these portraits were important to the East India Company. What versions of events did these artworks commemorate? I've deliberately chosen examples that were commissioned roughly 30 years apart. So hopefully, this talk will give you some idea of how much the East India Company changed over a 60-year period. The East India Company used these portraits to put across narratives of its choosing. Each portrait tells a story that was important to the East India Company. You could say it was a sort of propaganda, but was this propaganda successful? I'm going to start by looking at the painting of John Dean by William Verelst. You probably noticed that when you look at the bottom of the John Dean painting, there's a black bit with some gold writing on it. And the inscription there tells us that John Dean was the only survivor of 16 men who remained on board an East India Company ship called the Sussex. So I'm now going to give you a little bit more information about the Sussex. Way from India to London, and it ran into trouble round about here, just off the coast of Madagascar in 1738. Before it sank, its captain and most of its crew were rescued by another East India Company ship. And later that same year, that other ship, the rescue ship, got the captain and the surviving crew back to London. So that was in the same year, 1738. So when the captain, his name was Captain Gosling of the Sussex, reported to the East India Company back in London that the ship's cargo was lost at sea, along with the lives of 16 men, the company's response was to ban Gosling from East India Company service. They sacked him. And this would have been the end of this tragedy had it not been for the survival of one of those 16 men who allegedly perished on board the Sussex. And that man was John Deane. So John Deane reached Bombay in 1740 after spending over a year on Madagascar, searching for a ship that could rescue him. News of John Deane's survival reached London on the 17th of September, 1740. But John Deane didn't actually reach London until a year later. And when he arrived, he was a celebrity. The East India Company published John Deane's story in December 1740. Its publication coincided with this print on the left, which is based on a now lost oil painting by William Verelst, which shows John Deane standing before this rugged coastline. He's holding a spear and he's dressed in the ragged remains of his trousers. It was a real live Robinson Crusoe story, which was made even more popular by this image. And I've added the picture on the right of David Gandy, the famous menswear model, just to make a point that the print made the story popular. So John Deane's story was published by the East India Company in 1740. But as I mentioned before, Deane didn't reach London until September 1741. The published story was important to the East India Company because it contradicted Captain Gosling's narrative. John Deane's true and genuine narrative, it says at the top, true and genuine narrative, said that the 16 men who had stayed on board the Sussex did so because they thought the ship was still seaworthy. They wanted to take it to shore for repairs and to save its cargo. According to Deane's published narrative, Captain Gosling didn't want the 16 men to do this, so he decided to get rid of them. Gosling ordered the ship's carpenters to damage the Sussex's hull and mast before abandoning the 16 men to their fate. And once again, I want to emphasize, John Deane's story was published by the East India Company in 1740. If you look at the Roman numeral on the lower right corner of the cover page, it says 1740. But Deane didn't reach London until September 1741. So, John Deane reached London 9 months after his story was published. In 1742, the published story was used to prosecute Captain Gosling of the Sussex. He was ordered by the King's Bench to pay the East India Company £25,000 for his treachery. John Deane was the company's star witness. After winning the court case, the East India Company commissioned 3 oil paintings of John Deane. One of these is pictured here on the right. These paintings that the company commissioned show Deane returned to civilization and protected by his benevolent employer. What Deane's portrait doesn't say is that in the early 1740s, the East India Company was focused on earning profits for its shareholders and wanted compensation for the Sussex's lost cargo. And to do this, it manipulated one man's story of trauma to take away another man's fortune. Right, onward. The next portrait I'll look at was completed in 1772, 29 years after the Deane painting. The East India Company had changed considerably over those 3 decades. So first up, in 1746, the East India Company, as we all know, established a private army in South Asia. It was established to deal with its main European trade rival, the French. But by the 1750s and 60s, their army was conquering inland territories, and Robert Clive emerged as the most famous man in the East India Company's army. Along with men such as James Wolfe in North America, Clive became a sort of poster boy for Britain's emerging empire in the mid-18th century. And carried by a wave of imperialist nationalism, the East India Company experienced unprecedented growth in the 1750s and 60s. But of course, as we all know, that growth was a bubble. And when this bubble burst in the early 1770s, the Bank of England had to rescue the East India Company from bankruptcy. And it was about that time, in the early 1770s, that Robert Clive's reputation as a hero of empire unraveled. The East India Company commissioned the painting in 1770. It poses Clive as a philanthropist by symbolically showing the moment when the East India Company's pension scheme was founded. Edward Penny, one of the Royal Academy's founding members, was commissioned to make the painting. He was already famous for his paintings of men taking part in great historical moments. And here's another painting by Edward Penny. Oh, it shows General James Wolfe on Quebec's Plains of Abraham in 1759. So this painting was made shortly before the painting of Clive and the Nawab of Bengal founding the pension scheme. The story goes from the General Wolfe painting that he was mortally wounded in battle against the French. But before he died, he knew that the British were victorious. Wolfe was celebrated as an architect of Britain's new overseas empire, just like Robert Clive. Before the painting of Clive and the Nawab of Bengal was moved into East India House, it was exhibited at the Royal Academy's 4th annual show in 1772. I have to add, this painting is actually on exhibition again at the Royal Academy right now. It's part of the Entangled Pasts exhibition. If you have a chance to see it, it's very interesting. So going back to 1772 though, the year the painting was exhibited in the Royal Academy. In that year, Robert Clive's public reputation was falling to pieces. He'd been back in the UK for a few years, and he was believed to have been one of the wealthiest men in Europe. Immediately after he left India, Bengal fell under the grip of a famine. And then, soon after the famine was reported in England, the East India Company nearly went bust. So questions were quite reasonably raised about how Clive had accumulated his fortune. And while the painting was being publicly exhibited in the Royal Academy, Clive was summoned before Parliament to explain how he had obtained his wealth. Same year, a satirical cartoon based on the painting was published in Town and Country magazine. And that's it's the cartoon I have on the cover of the book. The cartoon portrays Clive as a coward and a criminal who was responsible for the Bengal famine. And then soon afterwards, in 1773, Robert Clive died by suicide. So the narrative that the East India Company sought to promote through this painting in the early 1770s, that Robert Clive was a philanthropist, was actually a total failure. The last portrait I'm going to look at is the marble memorial to Edward Cook in Westminster Abbey. Once again, I'll run through some changes that affected the East India Company between the creation of these two portraits. So first and foremost, between 1772 and 1800, Britain lost its American empire. And with the loss of most of its American colonies, India became even more important to Imperial Britain. Another event was the rebuilding of East India House in London. So at the start of this talk, I showed a picture of East India House. That building was completed in the early 1790s. And then finally, war had recommenced with France. I'm now going to run through the story of Edward Cook's death in 1799. Edward Cook was not a servant of the East India Company. He was an officer in the Royal Navy who took part in several battles during the French Revolutionary Wars in the late 1790s. And the ship he commanded was called the Sibylle. In 1799, the Sibylle unexpectedly clashed with an enemy French frigate at the mouth of the River Hooghly near Kolkata. Under Edward Cook's command, the enemy ship was destroyed, saving Kolkata from a suspected invasion. But Edward Cook was mortally wounded, and it took him 2 months to die of his injuries. He was buried in Kolkata's South Park Cemetery, which is his tomb is on the right here. He was 27 years old when he died. Just like James Wolfe, who defeated the French on Quebec's Plains of Abraham in 1759, Edward Cook died knowing that he had won. He had defeated the French. And in London, the East India Company acknowledged Edward Cook's sacrifice by commissioning John Bacon the Younger to sculpt his memorial for Westminster Abbey. It was completed in 1806. Just out of curiosity, how many of you had heard of Edward Cook before I started talking about him? There's one person, I bet you're a member of BAXA. And you, because you're my husband. Yeah. Right. So, well, I mean, this is worth noting. Very few people know about Edward Cook, even though he has a memorial in Westminster Abbey that was paid for by the East India Company. The really curious thing about the Cook Memorial is its position inside Westminster Abbey. It looks like it's installed against this very plain-looking wall. But this is not a wall. It's the back of another, much larger monument. And that monument is, you know where this is going? I bet you do. The memorial to James Wolfe. Edward Cook and James Wolfe were both young men who were slain in their moment of victory against the French, and the two memorials physically touch each other and are compositionally similar. The East India Company wanted to elevate Edward Cook's stature to that of a hero of empire through this association with James Wolfe. So was the Cook Memorial successful? In the early 19th century, the company promoted itself as empire, and Cook's sacrifice, as shown by this memorial, was proof of the company's importance. But you only noticed it if you took the trouble to look around the back of James Wolfe's memorial. So I'm going to finish up here. The East India Company used these three portraits to put across narratives of its choosing. Each portrait tells a different story about the East India Company and how it achieved its aims at 3 different points in time. The painting of John Dean relates to the extraction of £25,000 from Captain Gosling. The portrait of Robert Clive with the Nawab of Bengal was a public relations disaster. But when Clive's reputation as a hero of empire was revived, it was recognized as an important historical painting. And what about the narrative behind the Edward Cook Memorial? It was probably the least successful of the 3 because it's hidden in Westminster Abbey behind the larger and more famous memorial to James Wolfe. I hope you've enjoyed my short talk and that it has prompted your interest in my book. The book's first chapter, where you'll find the story of John Dean, is actually free open access on the Routledge website. If you want to purchase a copy of the book, you can go onto the Routledge website and use the discount code TAC30 to get 30% off. Thank you very much.
We only know of James Wolfe because of a famous poem.
Oh, I don't know the famous poem, Barbara. I know about James Wolfe because I grew up in Canada. And I think it's nailed into my head so many times.
In the 18th, enormous propaganda.
Yes,
So the size of
it's enormous.
it is exactly appropriate.
Yes, yes.
Edward Cook, I'm afraid,
Mhm.
know.
Yeah. Mm.
You know, what were the first and last objects commissioned?
The first and last objects. Well, the first extant object was Richard Greenbury's painting, which is in the British Library. But before that, there was the painting of the Amboyna massacre, which was then vanished by the King's Privy Council to prevent a diplomatic incident. But those artworks go back to the 1620s. And I found in the East India Company records references to, you know, the directors commissioning the artist to produce those paintings. And then the last one was the marble sculpture of Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, which was placed in the Court of Proprietors room, the room that I showed in East India House. And that was in 1855, I think. That was commissioned, yeah.
Did they ever not commission but buy something?
Yes, they did. Yeah, I mean, they sort of. I mean, there are these paintings. There are 10 paintings by Francis Swain Ward, which Ward painted them. They're all landscapes, and then the East India Company sort of did him some favors, let's say, in exchange for obtaining the paintings. So it wasn't quite purchasing them. But a lot of the closer you get to the 19th century and through the early mid-19th century, you have more and more people who are giving the East India Company artworks. Voted onto their directors, their board of directors, that kind of thing.
Did they only commission visual arts, or did they go into drama, opera, literature, poetry, music?
No, they didn't do poetry. And although I was talking to someone about what the East India Company was doing in Calcutta in around 1800, And they were really getting into music and balls and all kinds of things, sort of paying for those out of East India Company funds. Sorry?
Little England in.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, yeah. But I didn't include that in the book because I had too much material on London. So chop that out.
Ask you how the collection became dispersed?
Well, the paintings and sculpture are pretty much all part of the British Library's collections now. And so there's a curator at the British Library who's in charge of the East India Company paintings and sculptures. And some of them are in the Foreign Office, some of them are in the British Library building down the road. Then there are the contents of the India Museum, the East India Company's museum, which were divided up mainly between the V&A and the British Museum. Yeah, and those are the main places where the portable objects are. And then, of course, there are memorials in Westminster Abbey, which were commissioned by the East India Company. Yeah.
The East India House mentioned.
Mhm.
Waves.
Yes.
Can you say something about that moment when it was demolished? Clearly, I mean, the demolition, there wasn't any appetite for keeping it, or it was, I mean, it was just, was it associated with sort of that, you know,
Well,
the thinking behind it? Would be interesting.
yeah, so there's someone in the room who knows far more about it than me. So I'll try to answer that question, but forgive me, Margaret, if I get it wrong. Yeah, so my impression is that the East India Company, well, you know, it was being dissolved. So they just had to sell off their assets. They needed to sell the property that the building was standing on. So there was no love lost over tearing it down. And actually, before the Lloyd's Insurance building, which is currently there, was constructed, there were, between East India House and Lloyd's Insurance, there were 2 other buildings on that site. So it's just the way the City of London works, isn't it? Things get torn down and rebuilt alarmingly quickly. Jonah. Yes.
Wondering if what you said tonight, they look at what is the significance of staging that famous painting today?
Yes, well, I think that a lot of popular opinions about Robert Clive are hung up on the revival of Clive's reputation in the 19th century. And it's pretty much been proven that if you look at what was going on in the 1770s, that Robert Clive really, he was a villain. He was villainized by the British public, as you can see from that that cartoon. And of course, the exhibition at the Royal Academy is all about examining the Royal Academy's history in connection with imperialism and colonialism. So it is a star example of what was going on at the beginning when the Royal Academy was first founded. I mean, it's a stunning exhibition. It is very interesting. There's also a painting there of the death of General Wolfe. Yeah.
Can you say something about the word collection and what the East India Company collected, inverted commas, in India?
Yes, so there's, I mean, I guess the bits that I know the most about are, I've looked quite a bit at the Amaravati sculptures, which are in the Chennai Government Museum and in the India Museum, Kolkata. So there were other museums in India, where the East India Company was arranging for sculptures to be sent. And it's all a bit of a puzzle. Yeah.
Did the nabobs bring home the art? The men who came back to Britain?
Oh, yes, yes. Gosh, I mean, yes. Yes, it's not what I've looked at in my book, but yes, there are examples of that. I'm sure. Yes. Yeah. Richard.
You mentioned just a couple of camera sculpture in
Yes.
this. There seems to be a deliberate policy. Parts of it over all other parts. So, my expression, a Dara sculpture, farmer, Esperanto, Delta, and it seems to be part of the sort of education. Every part of it, some example of different parts.
Yes.
And so, the art sculpture, borrow, art sculpture. But Amaranth is also great. But I Calcutta, Delhi.
Yes. Yes. No wonder I just stuck to London. Hello. Yes. The first.
In a princely state, I don't know if that's a relevant, well, arms twisted or.
The first sculptures, yeah. The first sculptures were removed in around 1817 by Colin Mackenzie, but he only removed a few of them. And then this other fellow, Walter Elliott, came along in the, I think it was the 1840s. Yeah? Yes.
How was it just? Was it justified, or was it just? Did the rulers of the state?
It was not.
Yeah, I don't think there was. Yeah, it's a bit complicated, Amaravati. Yeah, it's very complicated because, of course, a lot of the sculptures were removed and used to make a monument in this marketplace in Machilipatnam. And then that monument was torn apart, and the harbor master of Machilipatnam took care of the sculptures, and then he refused to hand them over to the East India Company. I mean, it's incredibly complicated. I'd need to start giving another lecture really to get to the bottom of that. And yes, but it's very interesting. It's a real puzzle. Should we have some pakoras and prosecco?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.